So as we continue in this chapter, finishing up the parts of the cell, we can use this once again to help us with the parts of the cell and, of course, studying for that test on Wednesday. We left off at the point where we are talking about the plasma membrane. We had made it to the point where we had mentioned these proteins that are going to be embedded into the plasma membrane. We've been discussing the types of these membranes, and we left off at the point where we were talking about ligand-gated, voltage-gated, and we looked at that in relationship to, I think we used the nerve meeting a muscle fiber, okay? So at that point, what we were talking about is how these ions, the pluses and the minuses, how these ions are going to move across the plasma membrane, and they are going to, especially like in the nerve and the muscle, showing how it allows them to carry out action potentials. And that means letting the cells do an activity. And with the muscle cells, we showed that as being skeletal muscle movement, a contraction. So another type of protein that exists in the plasma membrane is termed a carrier protein. The carrier proteins, we also call them transporters. They are allowing movement of material from one side to the other. So we are looking at having movement occur from outside to inside the cell, but it could also be in the other direction. It could be from inside the cell to outside the cell. However, they have specificity, meaning the material that needs to move through this protein, it needs to match the structure of the protein. It has to fit the protein. So therefore, it is very specific as to what it allows to move across the membrane. Once again, showing how the plasma membrane is selectively permeable. So this would be keeping a substance from just simply crossing and going into the cell. When we say we have the carrier proteins, they can either move one particle at a time. One is uni. So if they're only moving one particle, one little tiny molecule, they are a uniporter. If they can move two molecules, but note, they move it in the same direction, meaning those two molecules move either into the cell or out of the cell. Whenever we have you ever heard of the term symbiotic? Okay, where things work together, okay? These are symporters, S-Y-M, or symbiotic. If it can move two particles, but one is going in one direction, one in the opposite. They are now working against each other, so they are antiporters. So this is the ability to allow substances to move in and out of the cell, however, very closely controlled. We can move one, we can move two. If we have two, they can go in the same direction. Anti, they move against. The next type of protein that can exist, and its job, it needs energy. So energy made by the cell, made by mitochondria of the cell, or glycolysis. This one is termed ATP powered. The only way for that protein to allow the movement of a substance, it needs the ATP to give it energy. So that ATP molecule, I'm not sure if you guys remember, but I talked about how that it had the phosphate head, and then it had the 3 phosphates, and the bond between the second and the third could be broken, and this phosphate becomes the energy. So the phosphate that can attach to it gives this protein power. When it does, it allows the movement of materials. The movement of the substances. We are dependent on how much energy is present and how much of the particle needs to move. One of the ATP-powered proteins that we talked about was the sodium-potassium pump. That sodium-potassium pump is what is going to allow, like for example, the nerve cell and the muscle cell to balance back to rest or to the norm. So that means if there is not enough energy in that cell, that can't happen. Once again, something that can become clinically significant. Okay. Another way that proteins can function, they can function as a receptor. As you move forward in the topics, and as we continue to learn about different systems of the body, the way that some of that's going to work to move material is letting one of these proteins act like a receptor. A really good example is the proteins of a cell that function for hormones. So if you think about, for example, luteinizing hormone, which is both male and female, and it will have a target cell. Because it is luteinizing hormone, it's going to target the gametes. meaning it's going to target egg and sperm. We're going to target ovaries and testes. When we have these proteins acting as receptors, this could mean we are not going to find this type of protein in every cell of the body. They may only be found in specific cells. For example, the luteinizing. We don't have every cell of our body make the estrogens, progesterones, testosterones. Okay? So they would only need to act on the cell that can create the product. So receptors can be different in different cells of the body. Does that make sense? Okay? So note how receptor proteins, because one of the things about the receptor proteins, they can allow movement from one side to the other. But what do you notice about this receptor protein? What do you notice about the structure of that protein and that particular molecule that's trying to get to it? Whitney?
It doesn't have a channel through the middle.
It doesn't have a channel through the protein. This is telling me that a lot of these proteins that act as receptors, they're going to, first of all, they're going to be specific. They're going to have a particular shape, and only a chemical that can fit into the shape can attach to this receptor. So this receptor is specific. So how is it that that makes anything happen in the cell? Proteins do the work of the cell, okay? So this means that this protein in this membrane can carry out chemical reactions. So if there is a chemical that can fit this protein, rather than this chemical having to move into the cell, all it has to do is attach. When it attaches, it will create activity within the protein. And attached to the protein is some other protein complexes. So if this gets activated, it affects these little ones next to it. They can now go do the action of that chemical. What could be that action of the chemical? Okay, let's think about this. Y'all are familiar with hormones, right? Okay. A lot of times when we think of hormones, what comes to mind? Estrogen, testosterone.